Good morning. Welcome to our GreenDeal-NET roundtable debate on prospects of global climate governance after COP29 and after, well, as the number says, many COPs. My name is Sebastian Obertür. I'm Professor for Environment and Sustainable Development at the Flemish Free University of Brussels and its Brussels School of Governance, as well as a Professor of Environmental Policy and Law at the University of Eastern Finland. And I have the pleasure of moderating this debate today. The topic of the roundtable, obviously, there are lots of roundtable debates these days on COP29. We want to explore a little bit the longer term implications of what happened in Baku at COP29. There were obviously certain decisions adopted by the COP or the CMP, such as the new quantified finance goal, the full operationalization of the international carbon markets. So what are the effects of these decisions on the longer term international climate governance? What other things have happened in Baku beyond the multilateral intergovernmental process? The Marrakesh Partnership, the high-level climate champions, the Global Climate Action Portal, activities of non-state actors have also been addressed. And there has been quite a bit of discussion about the process at this COP, building on the process, obviously, of previous COPs. What's been the role of the presidency? Can we still continue with consensus decision-making? Well, is there an alternative? One may ask, but also is the focus of the COP on these big decisions the right way forward? So these may all be questions that we address today. And I'm very happy and honored indeed to welcome a panel of distinguished colleagues and indeed also friends who will help us explore these issues. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak in the first round. So we first have Jacob Werksman, and he's Principal Advisor for International Aspects of EU Climate Policy at the Directorate General Climate Action of the European Commission. After that, we'll have Marie-Claire Graf, who is at Climate Action Network Europe, Governance and Strategy and Network Development Committee member, but also at the Youth Negotiators Academy, co-founder and Land Youth Negotiator Program lead. After that, we will go to Richard Kinley, whom many of you, I hope, still know as a senior and now former senior official at the UN Climate Change Secretariat. And finally, we'll have Jennifer Allen, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Cardiff University, but also Strategic Advisor for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. So welcome to you all. Great to have you. So let's get started with a very general question to the panelists. So to start with Jake, what are for you the major results of COP29 in terms of output and/or process? What do the outcomes and the process of COP29 mean for the future of global climate governance under the UNFCCC and beyond, and obviously geopolitically very challenging times? Jake, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian. Thanks for the invitation, and really looking forward to the exchange today. I'll be bringing the perspective of a negotiator. I think there are many different perspectives that you can give to this process, but my main role there as head of the EU delegation was to lead the EU team at HOD's level and into the negotiations. And so my perspectives about what happened procedurally and substantively are very much based on that. But I think it's always important to keep in mind that the COP is just one part of the governance structure under the climate change regime. It's the key political moment when decisions are expected to be taken, but there are many institutions that are operating under the Framework Convention and under the Paris Agreement that are generating outcomes throughout the year. But in terms of Baku and the main negotiated outcomes, I would say that it largely achieved what it was intended to in terms of the mandated agenda items that were expected to produce decisions. And those focus primarily, as everyone knows, on the new collective quantified goal for finance and the completion of the negotiations on the rules for international carbon markets. What it didn't produce is something that we expect of all COPs, which is a kind of a balanced package of signals, not just through decision text, but also through what is often captured in a cover decision, which seeks to ensure that all elements of the regime, not just finance and carbon markets, but also adaptation and, very importantly, mitigation, are captured as well. And what the Azerbaijanis have called the Baku Climate Unity Pact has within it substantive outcomes on finance, but really very little on mitigation, and the EU was disappointed with that. But setting that aside, I mean, in its function as regulator, we're talking about governance. I think that the COP and the CMA did deliver a new, very specific set of rules and regulations around the functioning of international carbon markets under Article 6, 6.4 with regard to the crediting mechanism, 6.2 with regard to bilateral deals on carbon markets. Those rules are now set in place, and we have the capacity for the machinery under the Paris Agreement to now kind of monitor the transparency and accountability of the application of those rules. It was also a very important point in time for the delivery of the biennial transparency reports from parties under the enhanced transparency framework. And I would say that's also evidence that the regime is working in terms of its kind of regulatory function of setting standards and holding parties accountable to those standards. It did deliver an outcome on the NCQG. I won't get into the details of that, but you know that we've set a new goal, both in terms of public and private mobilized finance of at least 300 billion, and then that overarching call on all sources to ensure that flows of finance from public and private sources are reaching developing countries as well, and that's at least 1.3 trillion dollar goal. So that is, I think, a good outcome. It's also trying to improve its impact as a catalyst of what happens outside the regime. And I think you can find more and more precise messaging in the NCQG outcome about what we expect of the international financial architecture, international financial institutions, both operating bilaterally and multilaterally, to do things like addressing the debt crisis that many developing countries are facing, and making other improvements in terms of trying to lower the cost of capital that we all recognize as a shared challenge amongst many developing countries in financing climate action. So there were reasonably good results there. I think we also saw the regime respecting boundaries between what it can achieve and what it expects other aspects of international institutional arrangements to achieve. And for us, primarily, that was in the context of the call for the climate change regime to more directly address concerns around what are called unilateral measures that have a trade impact. I think it was clear from the outcome that we found a way of both acknowledging that it's really the role of the WTO and the trade institutions to deal with the consistency of those measures with trade rules, while at the same time opening a space for having conversations around the need to address concerns like carbon leakage that emerge as a result of the asymmetry of regulations across different parties in the climate change regime. So all of that is relatively positive. I think we have to acknowledge that this particular COP came very close to failing to deliver on any of that. And I think we have to look deeply as to why that's the case. My own personal reflection is that towards the end of this particular COP, we really did lose control of the timing and the logistics of how it is that we produce decisions that are inclusive of all parties. And that's partly because I think that the Azerbaijani presidency decided relatively early on that it didn't want to play a very direct and highly visible brokering role it decided it didn't, for example, want to use the instrument of a cover decision to engage in an incremental way with parties in producing that final result. And as a result, there was a kind of a vacuum of responsibility and a vacuum of process into which a much more chaotic set of engagements took place. Some of which were happening at the technical level, some at the head of delegation level, some at ministerial level. And as a result of that, when the final gavel came down, I can personally say that I wasn't on top of every detail of what was in that set of decisions, and I shared some of the frustration from those that intervened in the end that were complaining that the process was not as inclusive as it should be. There was a lot of very kind of robust and muscular diplomacy going on in that chaotic space. Lots of engagement by the EU with partners, particularly the LDCs and SIDS, that did craft some compromises that I think will be very useful in the future. But clearly there were some, and India most visibly, that felt that they had not been engaged in a proper way in that deal, and that's why they made their concerns felt so clearly in the final stages of the negotiations. Maybe I'll stop there because I don't want to take up more time, but there were other things that I think that we could see were experiments in governance that didn't quite work. I don't know what happened to the Troika, which was supposed to bring some consistency and stability to the relationship between COPs. That kind of disappeared. It might have reappeared again in something called the roadmap, which is a bit of a black box in terms of developing a deeper understanding of what we agreed on finance. But maybe we can come back to that in the context of questions and exchanges. Thanks.
Exactly. And perhaps the other speakers will also comment on that, and we can discuss with each other. So to get there, we next go to Marie-Claire to get your take on Baku and COP29, please.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm calling you right now from Riyadh, where I'm attending the United Nations Desertification COP, or as we like to call it, the Land COP. One of the three Rio conventions. First, we were for biodiversity in Cali, Colombia. Then, of course, Baku, which will be the main attention of this call. But just wanted to highlight that here also there's a very important gathering happening on land, because ultimately all the climate solutions are ultimately going to be done on the land or on the water, despite we talk about the atmosphere and the CO2. And there's actually quite a lot of engagement here as well when it comes to bringing the biodiversity elements, the climate elements, then basically bring it home to the land. And yeah, so just wanted to kind of like put this on the onset. Also, that's why you see me like in the delegate office right here where I'm calling from. So still very much in the COP vibes, but it's very, very different. Of course, we are in the desert. So it's a little bit of a different vibe than in Baku. No cold winds calling us. So as you, Sebastian, has been rightfully mentioning, I have a little bit of a double hat, which is always difficult to balance. On one hand side, I'm in the board of directors for the Climate Action Network International, as well as engaged in the Climate Action Network Europe, as well as I'm the co-founder of the Academy, which trains young negotiators for the process. We have been training over 300 negotiators, over 150 of them have been engaging in the process. They come from all countries around the world. And with this, it's always a little bit of a challenge, kind of which hat I am taking. One on the civil society or one with the young negotiators. But what we can definitely mention that there's many civil society already on the onset, before even arriving in Baku, had a lot of concerns also regarding the human rights related issues of local climate activists and NGOs in Baku, and also their participation in the proceedings from the national, but also from an international level. Also on how international climate justice activists, specifically the ones also calling out the fossil fuel nations and standing up for the rights of the people and protecting the territories, indigenous populations, would be welcome, and how they would be treated. Also, there was a lot of controversy around the shrinking of the civil society space on the onset. So I think all of this already put a lot of civil society organizations, especially also when we talk about governance, in a very tricky situation on what they can say, how they can show up, how they can also be allies to the local civil society sector there. And Climate Action Network International has been putting also a lot of effort to support the local NGOs to take part in their in the COP proceedings as well. Then once we enter the negotiation, I mean, Jake, you already have been mentioning quite a few from civil society organizations. They have been calling it a betrayal in Baku. They have been calling it a failure for people and planet. On probably like when it comes to the finance piece, probably on two levels. First, because they are seeing, or climate action network, we are seeing that the ultimate agreement on the fund is too low, but also that there is too little special attention also given to the ones hit the most, and from a justice perspective, that there is a big gap in also like in how this will be delivered, especially also the kind of the indigenous peoples who have very little access, or also countries who haven't been able to access some of the grants will also probably be unable to access the grants. So there's, from a justice perspective, there is still a lot to do. On the other hand, also there was a lot of frustration, for example, with the Just Transition Work Plan and work program, where also the outcomes were not as expected. And especially, again, it's very much people-centered kind of work program, where where from civil society perspective, we see that the people are let down and not supported in an adequate way. Also, many civil society have been calling out some of the actors have been acting in bad faith and haven't been supporting. And I think also, Jacob, as you mentioned, there has been also at one point the process being taken away from the parties, a lot of like kind of back communication. And this again is very difficult for civil society because they are obviously not in the rooms and have been not consulted in an adequate manner, especially in the last hour. While this is of course normal as you have to move to a deal, it was obviously anticipated that we are ending up there. And I think that's what the civil society has been calling out. And also like many of the smaller nations have been, or kind of big nations with small delegations have been calling out for, that it's very difficult, of course, for them to attend. Many of them already had the travel scheduled home. So when this process is being taken away from the countries, of course, there is a lot of mistrust in the process. And I think this also came out quite clearly after the gavel fell. And many countries have been speaking up. And I think we as people who believe in the governance process, who believe in these multilateral platforms, also have to ensure that we strengthen the trust once again amongst the parties, but also different stakeholders, because again, also civil society who comes to these COP comes in an intention to support the process, comes also with a lot of love and dedication to ensure that we can actually run this process together. And I think there we need to be very, very careful in how we are running it, how we are supporting an open space, how we are embracing each other's differences and come and move forward, because these differences are representing and mirroring the differences we're seeing in the world, right? And maybe just to close off, also this is, I think, quite visible with the young negotiators. As mentioned, we had 150 young negotiators present at the COP. They are negotiating as part of their member state delegations. We have negotiators being part of over 60 countries. And again, there we also saw that there is quite a divide also intergenerationally speaking between young people from a country and maybe the older, more senior generation. And I think, again, there we have to do a lot of trust building so that, again, the generations can work together. And we saw beautiful examples on how this worked and actually how people could question each other and come up to new solutions. And maybe just like really closing on this, what you mentioned, Jacob, is a process, right? The COP is, of course, the highlight, is the most shiny and fancy one, which gets the attention, but we are working throughout the year. And I think when we can do even more kind of these debriefings and then already preparatory calls on how we can work together, we can really, really support each other and overcome these differences, not just come up to COP and then like, oh, we have some differences. Well, we all knew that we have differences, right? So that's why we have now a full year to really deliver on these ambitious outcomes when we are going to Brazil. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thanks very much, Marie-Claire, for bringing kind of this double hat, and but especially also the perspective of civil society. And while it may not be surprising that civil society is critical of the substance of the outcome, and also the process, perhaps also in combination with what Jake said, it appears that there was something more concerning going on in Baku as regards also the process than what is normal business. And who would be better placed to actually know the normal business than Richard, who has been around at the Secretariat for decades, now retired, but still a voice of wisdom, as I know it. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jake. You flatter me. I hope that there will be at least a nugget of wisdom in what I have to say. Thanks very much for the invitation. And even more, thank you for convening this discussion, because I think that with the 30th anniversary of COP1 just around the corner, it really is time to have some serious discussion about the sorry state of climate multilateralism. My starting point today is the reality that the world faces in 2024. Hottest year on record, it seems, surpassing the 1.5 degree temperature change threshold, global emissions still rising 30 years after the Framework Convention, ever-growing list of catastrophic events. And despite all this, we see in a number of countries rising political strength of what are politely called climate skeptics, but which I really prefer to call fascist reactionaries. And then we have COP29, Baku. And thanks to Jake and Marie-Claire for what I thought was a pretty good and fair overview of what happened, because there were some, yes, positive steps, but I have to say, having spent much of my professional career trying to justify that less than adequate COP outcomes were somehow progress, I just can't do it anymore. I think it's now time for some honesty in hopes that we can promote some change. We're in a climate emergency. We have to be honest, yet 50 or 60,000 people flew to Baku for more business as usual. I noted the statement by the group of climate luminaries, so-called, that came out during the COP, and that it created a bit of a stink. Hard to believe it actually had some pushback when it was, I thought, pretty straightforward. But clearly something is wrong. And first, for me, the first message of what's wrong is we need to revision what's going on here. The purpose, the luminaries' idea was the COP is not fit for purpose. And I think a better question, though, is what is the purpose of climate multilateralism in 2025? Not in 1995 and not in 2015, but now in the current context. And that purpose is not to save the world. I get so frustrated seeing media commentaries or leaders' speeches which reference some miracle deal that they somehow seem to suggest is going to come out of the COP, and that will turn things around. And to me, this is not a helpful benchmark for measuring what a COP is all about. For me, multilateralism has in general, not only in climate, but across the board, has a specific purpose, and that's to help national governments do more, principally at the national level, but also through international cooperation. And that could also be do more or sometimes agree to do less of something. And that the common thread is that it's on a problem they want to solve. So in that sense, multilateralism is an enhancer or a facilitator of action and not a place that delivers miracles. And I think we can look back, many of the people here have been involved in the process for a long time, and we can take pride in what has been achieved over the last 30 years. 3 significant, virtually universal treaties. Not that many processes can lay claim to that kind of impressive result. This very comprehensive system of rules, part of which was added to in Baku for implementation, and a vast array of systems, processes, the institutional regime is all very strong. And there is a significant chunk of funding that has been moved over the time frame, and each COP is to a certain extent a major awareness-raising event. And all of this, I think, does need to go on, but perhaps with less hype and new features. For me, the defining issue right now is that what is needed is action on the ground by governments and by business. not more COP decisions that are full of waffle and long-term aspirations, 2030, 2050. We don't need new agreements and new treaties. Governments are failing to act now or to act sufficiently, not because of an absence of international agreements. It's something else, and it's actually in spite of their obligations that insufficient action is happening. So the question, coming back to it, is how can multilateralism help governments up their game to get on with the magic, how to move into implementation mode? Perhaps it would be useful, I think, to ask domestic implementers what at the national level would actually help them be more ambitious domestically. I'd be very curious to know what they would say, if anything, actually. So to me, it then becomes a question of how to turn things around, how to change the conversation, and move away from vague agreements to something that is more impactful. And I had a few points of suggestion, which I don't suggest are panacea cures, but which I hope would be able to provoke a wider conversation about how to make this transition into implementation mode. For me, the first thing is it's better to focus on targeted initiatives that actually deliver results rather than vague general outcomes. We have seen sectoral initiatives and high impact measures considered before, but they haven't been particularly impactful so far. There's a number of examples we could maybe get into in the question period. I would also question whether universal agreements are actually needed in this context. Rather, would it not be more effective for coalitions of the willing or key actors to move forward together? Because this is often only a handful of countries, and that's the way to change economic realities. You had mentioned, Sebastian, about climate action and on-the-side initiatives. I think there's quite a number of good examples over the years, but the problem is that they have often failed in terms of delivery, transparency, and accountability. And I think all of these problems can be fixed, though. I would suggest, and I think Marie-Claire mentioned the just transition, perhaps it would be more effective for countries who are really interested in this objective to focus on what just transition or transition from fossil fuels would actually look like and to move on that. One can't get away without mentioning funding. Clearly, more is better, and there needs to be more delivery. And I think in the current context, we now need to have some serious look at levies, at taxes, and at economic instruments, because ODA is simply not going to deliver what's needed. And finally, Jake mentioned this too in terms of boundaries. Climate action is about all of government and all of multilateralism. And it's not just the UNFCCC process. A number of other international processes need to step up and get into the game and not just be fronts for the vested interests that tend to run things in FAO or in ICAO or in IMO, for example. To wrap up, I would say, again, the point of departure for me is what can multilateralism do to help governments implement more action? And which would have impact in terms of reductions and in terms of delivery of funding, not more decisions, not more workshops and more meetings and more flights and more work programs, but real action on emissions and funding delivery. I would say the onus then has to be on those governments who actually want to act to change things and to drive change. So the Nike approach, just do it. Domestically, in regional collaborations, in groups, and then to use the multilateral process to amplify this to the extent that is necessary. And results can also be brought in from these group efforts into the multilateral process to try to amplify them and magnify them. So I've said a few unorthodox things, and I look forward to the reactions and the comments that will come, and in particular to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Great. Many thanks, Richard. You have lived up to my expectations, so already. So one of these 60,000 who flew into Baku is Jennifer. And I could see on Blue Sky these days that you were following the negotiations closely. So I'm very eager to get your take, and then we'll perhaps spark a little bit more discussion on some of the issues that have already been raised, including by Richard. And continue the debate amongst us. Jennifer, but your first intervention, please.
Thank you. And next time, I don't know if I'll agree to go last because following Richard is always difficult, but thank you for having me. Yeah, I mean, I was sadly one of the people that flew in, and this was my 12th COP with the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. And so at the end of the meeting, what we do is try to wrap our heads around the entire meeting, what it means for the upcoming year or more, and write it into a maybe 2,000 word-ish analysis. And this year, I mean, thank you, Jake, for confirming this. I left with a very fuzzy sense of what actually had happened. And it wasn't just from pulling all-nighters. And that was unique. Usually you leave a COP and you can check the decisions, but you leave knowing, okay, here were the main bits that were agreed. And that was really difficult this year, in part because some decisions were agreed, some weren't, like just transition, but also there were these black boxes. So I don't know what that road to Belém and 1.3 trillion is actually going to do. I'm not really sure what's going to happen in some of the mitigation conversations other than a dialogue about cities, which is, you know, moving away from perhaps the focus on fossil fuels. So it was a very difficult outcome to try to get a sense of. And I didn't get the sense that there was actually a package. It seemed more like this year, it was a series of trade-offs. Within finance, we're going to have a trade-off between the size of the contributor base and the number that's put forward. Then from finance, we'll have a trade-off with mitigation. And really important topics like adaptation and loss and damage seem to fall through the cracks. And that might be because, more on this, because academically I'm interested in the role of the presidency. It might be because for the first time in several years, we had a presidency that really lacked capacity. A lot is made of oil and gas exports from Azerbaijan, but I mean, they were roped into this, maybe kicking and screaming. And so they lack capacity as a presidency team to really do something like a cover decision. And cover decisions are quite new. So for those who aren't kind of in the trenches, usually what they've been used as is a decision that tries to capture the narrative of the whole COP. They've also been used to bring in new ideas. So the Just Transition Work Program, for example, started in a cover decision. Commitments around doubling adaptation finance started in a cover decision. So it's been a mix of capturing what was agreed at a COP and then initiating new work or making new promises. So they've evolved and really started to fulfill this role only since about 2019. Before that, we would have a package of decisions that you could sort of see the logic of, usually explained to us in a strong presidency's closing statement sort of thing. But there was some sort of mechanism to coordinate across that package. And so this year, I mean, I was okay with no cover decision. Sorry, Jacob, I'm really not a fan of these. I was okay with no cover decision, partly because I don't know what would be in there anymore. You know, adaptation is pretty clear. What else is there to say on loss and damage? But we did lack that coordination. There was certainly very little, from my view, engagement in terms of what was happening across all of these decisions at technical and ministerial levels. There was a lot of shuttle diplomacy happening where maybe ministerial pairs would go chat to one coalition and then go chat to another one. And that's dangerous because if you miss someone out, you'll hear about it in public in plenary. And I think that's partly what happened. I think we also saw a breakdown in terms of, I mean, it's a shame because the word solidarity was plastered throughout the venue. So maybe they overdid it because there was certainly a lack of solidarity, I would say, among countries, also among G77 countries. It was quite noticeable what countries at the end said, we need to see guaranteed finance for the least developed countries and for small island states, and which countries didn't. And other developing countries were not calling for guaranteed finance for those groups. So maybe that was an oversight in a quickly written statement, but I certainly would hope that there is some sort of solidarity there for ensuring finance for the most climate vulnerable. Also, in terms of the presidency, I think perhaps what was a refreshing, I'll try to say something good. So what was perhaps a refreshing reminder at this COP was that we don't need heads of state there. So the summit, it happened. A lot of countries didn't send a leader, like Joe Biden didn't go. And it didn't matter. It didn't affect the negotiations in any way. It really caused some headlines. For example, when Argentina decided they were all leaving en masse. But that was it. So other than some kind of headlines and some media attention, there was very little that the political leadership and heads of state and government brought to the table. And I think this has actually been the case for several years now. That they arrive in Dubai or in Sharm, they give a speech on day one, and they're gone by day 2 or 3, most of them. And if you look at how many people, I mean, Azerbaijan, second biggest COP ever, and we were doing a finance goal. In Paris, there was fewer than half in terms of participation. So 25,000 in Paris, about 60 in Baku, and that was for a treaty. So, I mean, the size of COP is unrelated to the negotiation outcomes now. So if you get rid of world leaders, world leader goes, suddenly the Minister of Transport wants to come, or the minister for somebody else wants to come. And so there's been some work at the ECBI that shows just getting rid of that bit makes COPs smaller. And I would suggest smaller COPs are more equitable COPs. If we're worried about being in rich oil-producing states, we need COP to be smaller. We can't have 60,000 people showing up in a climate vulnerable state. I'm worried about Belém. I mean, they're already building hotels on the edge of the Amazon just for COP. What's going to happen to that when COP leaves? So if we can scale these down, the presidency's declarations kind of fell flat this year, again, because they didn't have a lot of capacity to make this work. But we didn't need them. These presidency UAE, Azerbaijan, and Brazil were supposed to be working together in partnership. And I saw, I mean, no evidence of that in the last year at all. I don't think Azerbaijan was even invited to the G20 energy and climate meeting. So that was hosted by Brazil. So if we don't have any continuity in all these presidency declarations and initiatives and effort, then what's the point? You know, we can promise something on phasing down fossil fuels or coal in the Glasgow cover decision. There can be a presidency initiative around transport. Nobody checks in later on, then it's pretty much just worth the paper that it's printed on, which is ironic if it's a deforestation one. So I think we really need to look carefully about the pieces of this giant, I usually call it the mega COP now, pieces of this giant complex that we've built and really ask if they're fit for purpose anymore, or if they can be a separate standalone event, or if we really need them at all.
Thanks a lot on that note. You have spoken quite a bit, all of you, I think, also just about how the COPs are run, what the role of the presidency is, what the role of the COPs is, even more widely. I think, Richard, was you like, what's the role of climate multilateralism? And perhaps let's dig a little bit further in that. You mentioned declarations, Jen. I'm not sure. I mean, there were these presidency declarations that you find on the internet, 9 of them, and then a 10th one that is not part of the package, but is also called a declaration. But anyway, and if you go to the Global Climate Action Portal, you actually find 85 new initiatives or announcements listed. And this has also been something that has been going on pretty much at the same time, it seems, as the cover decisions that came up. We have more and more of these initiatives that also, I think Richard referred to, lots of initiatives being launched, and then, well, for many of them, one doesn't hear a lot about them anymore afterwards. Richard kind of suggested that the COP, climate multilateralism, could have a role also perhaps in addressing what seems to be a lack of accountability, focus on implementation of those initiatives. Jake referred to the biannual transparency reports, which are also more implementation related. So really the question is perhaps back to Jake first, because as Jen was disadvantaged being the last, he was disadvantaged by being the first, so he couldn't really comment on the others. What's your take of what the role of the COP ought to be, can be, what the role of climate multilateralism can be? What can the COPs do also in the future? Can they change? Does something else need to be added to them? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I did try to structure my comments in terms of functions. You know, setting regulatory standards and holding parties accountable to them in the context of Article 6, and then generally with regard to following through on their NDCs through the enhanced transparency framework. The shaping of political will, and I think that the example of the finance goals, however we might be disappointed, whether reasonably disappointed or unreasonably disappointed with the scale of the commitment on finance, it will, as the current goal has functioned, it will create a level of accountability and political will that will lead to more finance being provided. I'm pretty confident of that. And then as this, catalyst of action elsewhere. And when I listed those, I completely understand the perspective of those that are disappointed in COPs, including Richard. I'm not here as a COP apologist. I recognize that as the problem grows bigger, the very kind of incremental progress that a COP represents becomes more and more disappointing over time. But there is, in partial answer to Richard's question, I sit here in DG Klima, which is primarily responsible for designing and delivering on domestic legislation. And when you ask the question, what utility does the COP serve in helping us do our work more effectively? It is first and foremost keeping Paris alive and keeping the sense that it is delivering, however incrementally. It does represent a global commitment to try to address this problem. And if it had collapsed, if Baku had collapsed, it would have undermined a very important next step in the EU regulatory process, which is coming up with our post-2030 NDC. So it provides, even if that is an increasingly, that narrative is increasingly wearing thin, that Paris is still working and it's still delivering, and that 1.5 is still within reach. the alternative, a COP that fails, is obviously much worse. But we also delivered on our BTR and took that very seriously. It's an incredibly important part of the implementation machinery domestically as well, to produce those national inventories and to track progress, et cetera. The Article 6 rules are going to be very influential in the way in which the EU thinks through our own carbon removal certificate standards and the way in which we will be accountable for linking our ETS with other countries. So all of that is very useful. Is it worth the emissions, the cost, the effort, the all of the bells and whistles that now seem to attach to a COP in order to generate those signals? Obviously, my answer would be no. I would be much happier with a much smaller and focused, scaled COP. To me, the real problem there has been much more to do with the political economy of hosting a COP, the political economy within the host country, of if they're going to spend X, more than 100 million hosting something, they have to bring a profile to it, including inviting leaders, including, that increasingly populist sense about crowd size. They have to demonstrate they had a big crowd. And I don't know how we break through with that. We were hoping it would begin to emerge with not being able to find a candidate willing to host a COP, and that puts you in a kind of a crisis situation. What do? We have to bring it back to Bonn. We have to scale it down so it becomes more affordable for smaller economies. But that unfortunately hasn't happened yet. Azerbaijan was not dragged kicking and screaming to this role. I'm not really sure. They fought hard for it, and spent a lot of political capital within their region and then globally to secure that role. And that is, again, goes back to the political economy of why. They want to raise profile of their country. They want to be seen to be an actor on the global stage, and you can't do that with a low profile COP. You can't achieve those two objectives simultaneously. Quick comment on cover decisions. I'm not a big fan of them either. I was just pointing to the fact that Azerbaijan was clearly signaling something about not wanting to take on that role, which was shifting responsibilities back to parties to kind of organize themselves in delivering outcomes rather than the presidency itself playing a central role in brokering those outcomes. And that happened in the end, but I think it happened more because we got lucky than because it was as terribly well planned. We lost control of the timing and the logistics around how you complete those deals, and that's why many of those deals, as I said before, were done through huddles on the plenary floor, moments before the final plenary opened. I'm not sure if that was responsive or sufficiently responsive. I mean, I hear Richard saying that we have to make COPs more fit for purpose. I assume that's partly also about downscaling, but every element of his suggestions that I agree with, I've also seen the COP process making happen. So the many meetings that we say shouldn't be happening are in fact the meetings in which national implementation and the sharing of best practices are occurring. And it's the COP that catalyzes those, and it's the Secretariat budget that funds them. And I don't know how you create that. We're trying all of that. We're trying everything simultaneously and at growing cost. And to me, sort of characterizing that as the COP not being fit for purpose, I'm not kind of completing the logical loop of the policy recommendations that are kind of anti-COP, pro-implementation, when it is the COP that makes that implementation process happen. So, I completely agree with downscaling. Let's definitely downscale the COP, but I don't think COPs and focus on implementation are mutually exclusive. Maybe Richard wasn't saying that either. I don't know, but yeah, thanks.
No, thanks. I may give you another shot later on, because there's a lot of discussion that the COPs should focus more on implementation and how that could look like. Obviously, you have the whole enhanced transparency framework that will come into operation more fully. But then there's also I guess the side of things, of initiatives, of clubs, of non-state actors, etc. So the next time I give you the floor, perhaps you can think in the meantime. So how can this evolve, develop as we move along? We know how it has operated so far, but I would want to go to Marie-Claire and get your take on downscaling, getting it smaller. Somebody said that could also be more equitable. Was it Jen? But there was also a lot of discussion in the community before the COP when badges kind of were restricted. And it was said, you can't send as many as you wish. There will be limits. And so there was also concern on that side that actually would exclude groups. So what's your take on this? And also feel free to comment on other elements that were raised.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would love to actually, on this regard, highlight the letter which was formulated by the Club of Rome on reform processes and coming up with very concrete ideas, because it's, as many of us mentioned, it's always easy to blame a process for what is not good, but it's harder to actually think what could be potential solutions. And we all have actually brought very beautiful, like a bouquet of solutions. So I will share this afterwards also in the chat, so it's accessible for you, but it's called the open letter on the COP reform for the UNFCCC process. And there are actually some very concrete kind of action items. And one of them is actually specifically on the on representation. So it's the item number 7. It's enhanced equitable representation, and there specifically it's pointed out that we have an overrepresentation of oil lobbyists and fossil fuel lobbyists also in the room, and this has been growing in the past massively. I think also when we talk about representation, who is there, who is not there, why are people not there, who is overrepresented, who is underrepresented? Also we talked, I think Jennifer, you mentioned before about the ministers, and I heard from a country who brought 5 ministers and they had 200 staff just to support these 5 ministers being on ground. I got this from the head of delegation. I'm not naming the country. You can probably do your own calculations. You will figure out which country it could be, because not that many countries actually had such large delegations. But I think there's already we already see that while we have to create a political momentum, I don't know how much actually it really trickles into the ambition which is coming out by having like 200 additional people to just assist 5 people who are doing a 3 minutes plenary intervention and probably have some other side conversations, but probably are more of a distraction to the process than actually supporting the process itself. I also want to challenge, it has been mentioned already before, that the bigger doesn't mean the more equitable representation. I think this narrative came up specifically also around COP26, where it was praised the biggest and the most representative. And there was actually a study done by Ringo, which is the research constituency, that actually the representation didn't get better by just having more people and having more batches. I personally think that we also, as we've previously been mentioned, that we have to take some of the pressure out of the COP of this one moment itself, where anyways, a lot of voices are not getting heard, right? And I mean, it's also my misconception of my very first COP when I was like this naive little person coming to a COP was like, okay, now I'm going to say something and everyone is going to pay attention. I mean, the reality is that unless you have lots of money or you're very, very influential or you're very known to the process, no one cares about you actually being there. I mean, that's a very kind of blank statement, but that was at least my realization. And I think it's important, especially for people who come there with a lot of hope that, oh, my voice is finally heard. If your face is not known, if your voice is not heard before, if you're not engaged in the process, your voice most probably will not matter. And I think that's also something we have to work on. So how can we not only ensure that there is representation, but actually that the voices are heard of people who are there, but also people who are not there? Because you can actually influence a lot on the national level, as been mentioned before by Jake and Richard and also Jennifer, and then can really support the implementation. But to kind of end on a very concrete level, where we have these, with the COP reform letter, I will post in the chat afterwards, there are 7 very concrete actions that, as the one already mentioned, on enhancing equitable representation, specifically also limiting the fossil fuel lobbyists in the room, recognizing the interdependence between poverty, inequality, and planetary ability, kind of bringing in the human element as well. We already talked in the just transition, for example, about it, but also on the agriculture negotiation. There are many interlinkages, yet I think that we can really do more There is one of the asks around amplifying the voice of science, specifically also highlighting the work the IPCC has been doing, especially as we're now going the next assessment report, ensuring robust tracking of climate finance. There is, I think, my favorite one on improving implementation accountability, specifically on the accountability, as a lot of action is also being unnoticed on the good and on the maybe less good side. Streamlined for speed and scale. And the last one, which also already like sparked some controversy before, is about the selection process of the COP presidencies. And they specifically have eligibility criteria to support countries who actually want to make the transition away from fossil fuels and actually want to be leaders, and contrary to countries who are kind of like rather forced in a position and then kind of like do it because they have to, which then leads to less ambitious outcomes. I think those are some very concrete ideas on how we can bring more accountability and more also like kind of like more energy back to this process, and with this also increase the trust of parties, but also civil society once again in this process.
Thanks a lot. Others may want to comment. A couple of reflections, perhaps, as we continue, and perhaps, I don't know who goes next, Jennifer or Richard. Obviously, some of these reform proposals that are sometimes being made, one may wonder how they get implemented in a setting where consensus decision making is done. So there is limited room for different actors to move forward, but happy to hear comments by you how that could happen. Reflecting on what you said, where you're coming from all, I think it's very clear that there are different functions of this COP event that seems to be out there. Jake already said there's this regulatory function, obviously, that it has to fulfill, and that there's generally all the processes, the negotiations that take place, and that perhaps includes also conversations about implementation and accountability, etc. But then there seems to be this, what Marie-Claire was more referring to, I think. It seems to be the event during the year where people at the COP compete for the world's attention. And you were talking about voices to be heard, but how does one make our voices heard, right? At the event, if you're not in the negotiations. And then there's the whole global climate action agenda with these initiatives that are also, I guess, a little bit in that space and in between. So which may be, and this kind of the world's attention may be at odds with, oh, let's all make it smaller and downscale it. But, just let me also raise a couple of questions that are in the chat already, in the question and answers. There's a question about the frequency, with somebody asking actually whether we should have biannual COPs. I think it's meant to be biannual, so whether they should be every 2 years rather than every year. There are questions about, actually a little bit towards what Marie-Claire perhaps was talking about, a bigger role for non-state actors, civil society, even bringing in more people, more different constituencies, local level, etc. And there's one specific question also about Article 6 and how that may play out in the EU. I don't know, Jake, whether you later on could say anything further about that, because I assume that's also still to be seen what exactly will happen in the EU, but perhaps you can share a couple of thoughts later on. Jen, you want to go next? And I put Richard last.
I think the question about frequency is an interesting one, and this is actually currently debated in the subsidiary body for implementation under a very boring title, Arrangements for Intergovernmental Meetings, which is fascinating when you get there, if you're a bit of a process nerd like me. And Marie-Claire. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has its COP. Let me see if I get this straight. The COP is every 2 years, but those are every year. So the climate analogy would be that the Paris Agreement body, the CMA, meets annually and the COP meets biannually. This sounds like a good idea, but in perhaps typical climate UNFCCC ways. There's a lot of disagreement right now about what's under the COP, what's under the CMA, and what should be under both. And until that's resolved, it's a limited number of issues where this is popping up, but it is something that would probably have to be sorted first, or at least like what their distinct roles might be. So some countries, LDCs, for example, are very much against this. So it could be useful, but it's politically tricky, I would say. And in terms of widening participation and expansion, I would say, I'm fascinated what a lot of people want to do at COP. So when I have downtime, I often just wander around and ask people, like, why are you here? And I did that for my book dissertation as well. And this was also a problem in 2005. I remember talking to a labor union person who said, I was wandering around Montreal with this report on green jobs, and I had no idea who to talk to or how to make this thing land. So even small COPs have this problem of your voices being heard. And I think maybe the one nice thing about the Paris Agreement is that it relocates so much action to the national level that is where civil society can be heard and have a voice and really bring forward those context-specific questions and solutions that are often completely ignored at the global level. So I would love to see sort of fostering of networks and network type approaches to really help civil society at the national level have an impact. I think that could be very, very powerful and maybe also help slim down COP a bit.
Thanks a lot also for commenting already on the frequency. I had to smile a little bit because obviously Richard and myself also we've dealt with the intergovernmental meetings agenda item for some time, and we've had obviously discussions throughout the years whether to move to biennial, and then you look at the scheduled work and anyway, and you look at the politics of it and you wonder whether that would ever happen. But Richard, up to you to perhaps comment a little bit on what you've heard, also on the comments on your comments, please.
Thanks, Jake. I mean, it's been really interesting, and I particularly appreciated Jake's reaction to my question about how implementers see the COP. I really think that this could lead us in some positive directions if we had more concrete response to this. And it is true that certainly over the many decades, if we hadn't had the COPs and the multilateral process, nothing would have happened nationally in many, many countries. And I remember once being told of someone who was completely outside the process, but they were lauding the Kyoto Protocol in those days for keeping the debate alive when going was really tough. You mentioned arrangements for intergovernmental meetings, my favorite agenda item of my career, but also my most frustrating. And it leads me to the conclusion that nothing will ever be agreed in terms of reform. It's impossible. And the most that one can hope for is enlightened presidencies and active secretariats who can nudge things along in a good direction. And for me, ideally, that would be, I don't think we'll ever get away from annual COPs. And I actually think, despite what I was saying earlier, my frustrations, I think that these functions that Jake was elaborating are important. Every organization needs to have an annual meeting to take stock and keep things on track, but it doesn't need to be hyped to the extent that the COP is, and it certainly doesn't need everybody there. So I guess I'm a bit of a participation skeptic on some of these things. But I do think in terms of frequency, something that would be more productive would be the idea of summits every 5 years or something like that. Yes, heads of state have a role to play, but not every year, periodically. I guess you'd need to rotate it through the regional groups or something, but there could be solutions there that might be worth pursuing. I know there's been a lot of conversation about the role of fossil fuel interests in COPs. And I'd be interested in what Jake or others think, because they were actually there. But would the results have been any different if the fossil fuel interests had not been there? I'm a bit skeptical, actually. That's not to say that they are a positive influence, but I think the dynamic is different, and we need to focus on what the real problem is, not on what's going on the margins. And that I think brings me back to this point that the real defining question has to be about impact. And if meetings have an impact, yes, that's great, but the impact has to be measurable in terms of changing policy, in terms of affecting emissions, and in terms of affecting funding. And I just see so much, it's so easy to create a new work program and a new process and a new implementation committee, all of which turns out a lot of work and doesn't really lead to very much. We need to be much more critical of what makes a difference.
Great. Thanks a lot. Let's dig a little bit, and I will mention a few things that are in the question and answers, which also gives you a feeling of what people obviously listening care about. There is, for example, the issue that was obviously at the beginning of the COP when the agenda was discussed, a relatively high profile, unilateral measures, right? And what CBAM can do, and whether that is something that should or could be discussed in this process, but also what kind of positive force it could be. There's a question about support for LDCs in particular, for them to be more active and a more active force in international climate governance, and also something about CCS, but perhaps that is a bit well, you choose whether you can respond to that. Let me perhaps raise, already Richard mentioned, committees, roadmaps, etc. It's something that strikes me when I look at outcomes that over the past years, and it's probably always been the case, but perhaps it's also a sign of the geopolitics of this. Oh, Marie-Claire disappeared. But okay, hopefully she can rejoin. We obviously, the COP seems to tend to create new processes where it can't agree on the substance, one may say. But so where do we go from that? But I have another issue. If we look forward, next year obviously will be impact, Richard, right? NDCs also being put forward, the next ones by countries. What's the likely impact that COP29 and the decision taken will have on that process? Is there something one could imagine? Is it a positive or a negative impact that, for example, the financing, but also the international markets decisions would have on that process? And there are the other elements of moving the COPs forward. Perhaps I go again to you, Jake, to address some of these issues. Please.
Well, thanks. So a lot of issues there. I mean, impact of 29 on 30, and in particular, development of NDCs. Well, I mean, I think the most positive impact is that the Paris Agreement machinery is still churning on. The Baku, although a disappointment to many, was not an absolute failure, and so there is every expectation that we'll keep on track in terms of the delivery of the NDCs next year. There, of course, developing countries will say that as a result of being disappointed by the finance commitment, that they might have to lower their ambitions with regard to the delivery of their NDCs. If that's the case, then Paris really isn't working, because I don't think that the amount of resources offered from the public part of the NCQG could ever have been at a scale that would literally give all developing countries, particularly the major emitters, the confidence that they need to commit to more ambitious emissions reductions. That money was never there for them primarily in the first place, and it's to them, the G20 members, that we really need to look to bend the curve and to make sure that the synthesis report that comes out before COP30 shows that we've significantly closed the ambition gap. So, you know, our plans as the EU is to really to bring on the bilateral diplomacy as strongly as possible to create as high a bar of expectations of delivery of NDCs as we can. One of the real disappointments for us from Baku is that we were not able to get any clearer signals with regard to, for example, the energy transition goals from just a year ago, and what that should mean for the upcoming NDCs with regard to transitioning away from fossil fuels. And that's where we felt the influence of the fossil fuels interests the strongest in Baku. It was not because the oil companies were there. It was because the oil producing countries were there. They don't need any oil companies to be there in order for them to advance and defend and promote the interests of fossil fuel production and consumption. So, I mean, I would agree with Richard. The presence of the oil companies is probably on balance a better thing than a bad thing. It's the countries themselves that more than effectively represent those interests. So, you know, the strength of that voice and that influence in shutting down even the mildest signals that parties should be taking the Dubai transition goals seriously was a very, very worrying outcome. And that's what took down the Just Transition Work Program, and that's what took down the decision on the UAE dialogue and the follow-up to the GST, was that unwillingness to include anything specific on the follow-up, and that is very, very worrying indeed. On Article 6 in the EU, I think I already mentioned that you know, we played a very strong role in trying to get as high standards as possible into the certification methodologies for the crediting mechanism under Article 6.4, and we would expect that to influence the way in which the EU, for example, designs our corporate disclosure requirements with regard to the use of offsets, because we set high standards there, and we would now expect companies that are claiming to be net zero and are using offsets to meet those claims to follow those standards as well. We still haven't completed that legislation, but that's an example of how Article 6 will relate. And then, as I said before, the way in which we are linking with Switzerland and with Norway and Iceland will also be governed by the Article 6 rules on bilateral relationships. And now we know how we can be as transparent and as accountable as possible through those bilateral arrangements. And we know how to hold other countries accountable as well, because we now have those additional rules. CBAM as a positive, yeah, I mean, I think CBAM, its potential to bring positive actions in our trading partners is quite high, but I think that also depends on our being able to listen carefully in terms of how the CBAM regulation is being implemented, to support our partners in implementing it, and to be able to make adjustments over time to make sure that its impact is as targeted as possible in preventing carbon leakage in a transparent and fair way. So I think that its potential is not tapped fully. It is, we know, the source of discontent about what comes under the heading of unilateral measures, the CBAM and other similar policies that the EU is putting in place, but other jurisdictions are putting in place as well. And as I said before, I think we struck a good balance in Baku in making clear that this is not the responsibility of the UNFCCC to discipline the individual policies of parties, particularly against standards that come from the WTO regime and not from the climate change regime. That is for the WTO and other trade-related institutions to take the lead on. However, we have created a space in the Response Measures Forum for having what we hope will be non-prejudicial, constructive conversations about how it is that parties who are moving to higher levels of ambition can address cross-border spillovers, including negative spillovers like carbon leakage, through policies like CBAM. That space is now clearly open, and we're looking forward to having conversations within that space that are less confrontational than debates over whether or not to have an agenda item.
Great. Many thanks, Jake. And what you said about the energy transition goals and then the fossil fuel interests of a number of parties obviously speaks also to the issue that's brought up. Well, it has been brought up over the whole 30 years of the existence of the regime, namely decision making by consensus, which I don't think there is a good chance of changing that. Which brings up the issue of how countries that don't want to be held back by it can move forward, which links to what Richard said, these initiatives, clubs, etc., and how that space can be used by countries who want to move forward and want to advance these energy transition goals, etc. Obviously, there are some other fora that are out there already, G20, etc. But the question still, I think, that deserves also some thinking from all of us is how all of this can be, these initiatives can be potentially usefully linked to the COP, to the climate multilateralism that Richard was talking about. So in a sense, all of this, that's just the point I wanted to make, seems to be interlinked with where you're blocked and how you try to find your ways around it, right? And advance nevertheless. Thanks a lot. And obviously what some people on Article 6 and the EU may have in mind, but it's difficult without knowing what the EU will exactly decide in the end, is whether international credits might be used and in what way by the EU, including in the ETS, but I will not put you on the spot on that. Good. Perhaps moving again. Well, let's change the order a little bit. We have another 9 minutes left, so I guess what you have to say is kind of the final words also. Richard, further reactions, further elaboration of what you see should happen. We haven't talked a lot about your proposal of talking more about levies, taxes, economic instruments, but yeah, also what you've heard from others. Where do you see the COPs moving and where should they move? What are the longer term implications?
I mean, obviously, it's a moment of difficulty to see we have something that isn't working the way we would like it to work. And it's easy to throw stones at something, but in throwing out my ideas, I was trying to think of ways what can positively be done, because I don't hold much hope for things like resolution of rules of procedure or streamlining the agenda, those sorts of things. They just seem politically intractable. And I would ask the question, what does it really matter in the end when we're really out of negotiations? When voting rules would have been helpful was when you were adopting treaties. But we're sort of in another stage now. And that brings me to this sort of idea of the side agreements or the clubs, where I think more can be done there. It's not a panacea, but I really think more could be done by turning these initiatives into something meaningful, where the countries and the businesses involved actually sign something that makes a commitment. And I've then wondered about, and I don't know that this would in the end not be blocked by those who don't want anything to happen, but there's a very nice little provision in Article 7.2c of the Convention that allows the COP to facilitate action at the request of groups of parties. Could that be a hook by which some of these initiatives are brought into the multilateral process, and then the accountability mechanisms and the monitoring mechanisms of the UNFCCC are actually then used to focus on action, which is actually happening on the ground? To me, that's something that could be explored. I don't know if it would work, but basically we're grasping at straws for how to move out of this, paralysis is too strong a word, but this talk shop mode, and get into something which is much more action-oriented, which we desperately need at this time. So that I hope, trying to be a bit positive, would inspire others to have better ideas, and that we could actually then move towards some sort of better status quo.
Thanks a lot. And I have heard that legal provision being referred to earlier. Always makes me wonder, because your first point is whatever you want to decide politically, because it's by consensus and you can't change that, is kind of doomed, kind of changing the agendas, etc. What would be different if you use that agenda item, because it would need to be decided by consensus? So one may also think about using the leeway, as I said, that some actors, like, and you referred to them, the presidency, the high-level champions, the secretariat, have to develop something that perhaps doesn't replace what we have there, but just builds something that's a useful addition in terms of accountability, etc. But certainly food for thought. Marie-Claire, if I can go to you next to share some of your thoughts on what you've heard about all these proposals, and then Jen, you will be last again. Sorry.
I thought now Jen goes next. So we have some equitable representation also here on the panel with the order. Well, I mean, a lot of ideas have been shared. I think now, I mean, also ongoing, and some of you have been already sharing. In Switzerland, I have been a former Swiss negotiator, have been proposing changes to the cycles of the COP, and very often these kind of ideas for reforms very quickly have a very quick death in the process, because many people also like really hold on to the process and really don't want to deviate. So I think Richard, you mentioned it before about the kind of creating a coalition of the willing around also like really like not do the reforms for the reform's sake, but actually doing the reform to once bring back the meaning and the trust into this process, what it was created. I mean, it's 30 years. I was not born 30 years ago. The world looks very different, and it will look very different in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that's what the process needs to adapt to. So maybe instead of calling maybe the reform, which can lead to a lot of kind of people are rather backtracking than being excited, is kind of like making an update to the process. Because I mean, it's always fascinating when I talk to people who have been there the first COP, where literally the name tags, like the things were like written manually, or like with like, the old, I don't even know how to call it in English. When you were typing, there was no process, no registry. And I mean, to me, it is like, oh my God, like that seems like kind of like 100 years ago, but it was when the process started off, right? So like, how can we also ensure that we are going with the time? Because the time is changing, and there are incredible opportunities for us also to kind of go with the time, instead of kind of just like having our little cocoon and we're like hiding in there. But for this, we need a coalition of the willing, which kind of transcends to the different, to secretariat, the parties, to media, to the civil society, and really like kind of build also like a coalition, which is a global representation. And I think there we have not yet been able to build up such a coalition to really move forward on these ideas, because the ideas are great. They have been there for a while. Many of us have been thinking about this. Richard has been thinking about this for a very long time, longer than me. But now we really have to bring it to the paper, because otherwise we're going to go into COP40 and we're still talk about the potential reform idea. So I think like now it's really like maybe what I want to summarize from all of these really beautiful and exciting ideas. It's, I think, for us and others to kind of like make these steps ahead, be very concrete, work on proposals, and then probably sit through the AIM negotiations, as Jennifer has been mentioning. I find them super interesting, but I know that they're very often it's meant as the last item on someone's agenda. But yeah, kind of give it attention, give it the care also needed, and the nuances, that we are not creating more division and more kind of tension in the system, which is already there, but actually like coming with a sense of how can we jointly overcome what we currently see is no longer serving us. And also, I think like maybe just like my last point here, also ensure that actually the negotiators themselves can thrive in the process. But we from our side to put a lot of effort also in supporting our young negotiators with mental health support and also other support structures. I think we cannot achieve good outcomes if we are draining us as individuals to the very end, and people who just like physically can no longer do it. There will not be a conducive outcome. There will be nothing but something we are all excited about. And I think that's probably also something, an additional layer, the human level to it, which very often is getting forgotten when we are focusing so much on the process, and which we all trying to follow, which is just not really serving us as humans. And we can literally see this. I mean, like myself, I got sick like after the COP, many people fall sick, and that's not the role we want to create and kind of what we are aiming for, right? So let's not forget the humans, and let's build the coalition of the willing so we can jointly work on this. Now handing over to Jennifer, right?
Yes, with me in between. Sorry, because well, I'll just read the two last questions that have or summarize them. One is about the role of non-state actors, including NGOs and private sector entities, how their effective contribution could be enhanced, and then also about COP30 and whether there will be more of a chance of getting the feeling of a climate emergency, which kind of brings me also to the point we were talking about presidencies and that they can be quite influential. Perhaps summarizing these two questions by just asking you also, Jen, if you can say something about how you see the next presidency taking up what has happened and moving it forward and their role. That would be great. Thanks.
Sure, just those, hey. I mean, I think one thing that this conversation, these questions highlight is that, you know, we're in the world of the Paris Agreement, and you know, Jacob has said that it's still working, but I would say it is creaking as a machinery. And next year, the big job that's sitting, well, there's a couple big jobs sitting on the Brazilian presidency's shoulders, but one of them is to try to elicit more ambitious NDCs. And I can't believe I didn't mention the global stock take from last year, because that was my baby. Well, not mine, but I feel like I was in there. Because that is really the test of this Paris Agreement, right? That countries came together, collectively decided what needs to happen, and then it's supposed to inform NDCs. Now, there's no agreement on what that word inform means, and that's why the UAE dialogue decision couldn't be taken. For some, it's sort of this moral inspiration that will somehow fit into their NDCs, and for others, there's a process. And so we're trying to figure out, as we go through this first cycle of the Paris Agreement, is it working, and how do we get the institutions, whether it's the COP, whether it's engagement with external bodies, everything from WTO to the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how do we get those connections right, or to what extent do we break some of those connections? And so there's all these questions that are wrapped up in the Paris Agreement that I feel like we're struggling to unpack, and we're trying to find the right institutions to do it. Because if we didn't have a COP, I think we'd need to invent it. So that, you know, coalitions of the willing are fantastic, and I think on a sectoral level that makes a lot of sense, but we can't lose adaptation, and we can't lose loss and damage. And my worry is those could get lost if we didn't have something like COP. And then there's also, we need to get civil society engaged. I still think the strongest role is at the domestic level, at the national and regional levels, because that is where the action is going to have to be, rather than at this global level. And so going into the next COP, going into 30, we have NDCs that need to be announced, preferably in a couple months, but I think most will probably be in the fall. We have this Belém 1.3 trillion dialogue, which I think Jacob rightly called a black box. I'm not really sure what that's going to be. So the Brazilians will have to build the airplane as they're flying it. And then we also, you know, there was that Mission 1.5 that created the Troika, which I didn't hear a lot about, but that could have just been my blind spots. So there's a lot of ambition, I would say, on the part of the Brazilians, and they have an awful lot of work. But one thing certainly is that this is a presidency that will be robust, that has capacity. And so I think that will be a very welcome, in my view.
Great. So perhaps they will even be open to discussing some of the thoughts that people have had on how to develop the overall system further. We'll have to see that. I would like to take the opportunity now at the end to thank all of you a lot for your engagement. I think I had a very interesting discussion. And it's certainly not the end of it. We all know that. It's going on in several quarters. How to reform the COP, how to move forward. As Jen said, next stops kind of also for proving that the system is working, as Jake said, is the NDCs that are supposed to come forward over the coming year in, as I said at the beginning, geopolitically very challenging times. And I think that is above all shaping a little bit the process at the moment as well. Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to the next opportunity to explore these issues with you, the panelists, but also the audience. Thanks very much and hope to see you very soon. Bye.